Welcome to Gross Domestic Problem, the podcast that tackles America's biggest and most urgent crisis head on. The economy is on the brink. Americans feel it. But what if the real cause of the squeeze in their bank account, like an iceberg about to sink a ship, was mostly invisible? That iceberg? The national debt. Every episode of this show will be focused on unveiling this slow motion disaster. How do we get here? What happens if we don't get it under control? And what's the least painful way out? And what do we do in the meantime? There is no do-nothing solution, and every solution will require some sacrifice. But refusing that pain for ourselves means handing it on to the future with little to no control over who it hurts. And if you're like us, that's unacceptable. So let's dive in.
All right. Zach, thanks so much for agreeing to join me here on the show. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
I know, of course, you and I have known each other for a while now, but a lot of people who are going to be hearing this have never heard of you, don't know you from Adam. Just give us the quick, rundown, 30-second Reader's Digest version. Who is Zach? How did you end up in where you are? How did fiscal policy become a thing you think about? And what's your story to get here?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Zach Moller. I'm the director of the economic program at Third Way. Third Way is a center-left think tank in Washington, D.C. We're the moderate Democrats think tank. I've been here for 6 years. Before that, worked in federal budget policy at another think tank. And before that, got my start in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. I was an economic analyst at the Senate Budget Committee under then Chairman Kent Conrad and Patty Murray. So I come from that, okay, here's just how Washington works. I got I cut my teeth on budget bills and then have just transitioned more to the policy world. I trained to be an economist. That's my academic background. And come to DC thinking I was going to be in federal budget stuff, but that's where everything was going. And, that's what I've gotten to do and gotten to enjoy it more and more. I mean, as enjoyable as the most boring yet scariest thing in Washington can be.
Right.
But yeah, it's been a wild ride. And I mean, I'm only now just starting to hit my mid-career, so we'll see how it goes from here.
Great. And so Zach, obviously the regime has changed. Last time you and I met, we were right in the middle of the Biden administration. In fact, I think it was just after midterms in the Biden administration. Obviously, you guys are oriented towards the powers that be right now in a different way. And one of the things I was most interested in, first of all, I think most of the people who will be listening to this show are probably accustomed to thinking of fiscal policy, national debt as something that Republicans talk about. Why is that wrong?
Yeah, I think Democrats have a very strong record of attempting to pay for the additional policies that they want to pursue. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was Joe Biden's second big budget reconciliation bill, was fully paid for, had a lot of tax offsets, and actually reduced the deficit, or would reduce the deficit. Obviously, the Trump administration is coming in now and wanting to reverse some of those things that would save some money. But I think, just like not all Republicans actually care about debt deficits, not all Democrats really care about it. But here at Third Way, we focus a lot on it because I think it feels like it's the right space for a lot of moderate Democrats, people who need to go back to their constituents in New Hampshire or Ohio or wherever across the country, and they just need to explain that government wants to do this, therefore we need to find the best ways to pay for it.
Replacing one misconception and doubtless oversimplification with another, is the difference here that Republicans care about fiscal policy and want to lower spending, and Democrats who care about fiscal policy want to raise taxes? Is it that simple? Of course it isn't that simple. But where am I wrong?
Yeah, look, I think that is an overgeneralization. I think the core nugget of that is there's a strong point that Democrats may appreciate a larger government than some Republicans, but also there's a values difference in what they would want to spend money on, right? I think Republicans focus a lot more on spending on national defense than Democrats. Democrats often focus a lot more on social programs, safety net programs, or some other investments than Republicans. And I would say that Democrats don't have an allergic reaction to raising revenue, increasing taxes, than Republicans do. And Republicans really have. It is very much like an allergic reaction. But that is, the debates we're going to see play out now that Republicans have the House, the White House, and the Senate. They're going to have to figure out how to enact a whole bunch of tax policy, potentially a whole bunch of spending policy that they want to do, and then find the ways to pay for it.
Right. Yeah. Especially with the new regime, we're looking at just in the next year, we're looking at the extension or permanence or something of a massive tax bill that was Trump's signature policy achievement during his first administration, along with a debt limit that's going to come up. When you look at the fiscal situation, obviously, the Trump administration is going to want to extend and make permanent his signature policies. But what are you afraid is going to get left out? What are you afraid, looking at the next administration? What's likely to get ignored in the Republican way of doing it, or in this Republican way of doing it? What are you thinking? What are the ideas you're afraid will get missed?
Got it. Yeah, that's a great point. I think I can break it into we'll call it like three buckets. There's some stuff related to healthcare and healthcare savings that I think would be good ideas. There's places in defense spending, and then it's of course the revenue conversation as well. But let me start with healthcare. Not all healthcare spending is the same, and I think there's a lot of situations where people are paying for healthcare provided in some circumstances at some locations more than others. So like a hospital-owned clinic is more expensive to get healthcare at than a doctor's office.
Yeah.
This is often called site-neutral payments. Yeah. And because the federal government through Medicare and Medicaid pays for a lot of healthcare, instituting site-neutral payments could have substantial federal savings on the spending level, and actually hopefully make healthcare a little bit cheaper for the consumer at the end of the day. This isn't something that just Democrats like, though. There's been a series of kind of big think policy developments happened over the last few years, but places like AEI and the American Enterprise Institute, Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Progressive Policy Institute, among others, have all said, oh yeah, this is a good idea, and could save in the magnitude of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, not trillions of dollars, but
Did you say
hundreds of billions of dollars
per year?
Sorry,
or over the 10-year window?
Over the 10-year budget window.
And
but
just
we're
really
talking
quickly, just again, sure. Because most people who are going to listen to this they're just not going to know even some of these, they're just not in this world.
Yeah.
What is the 10-year budget window? What does that mean?
Absolutely. That's a great point. Sorry, apologies for talking in budget jargon. So there's an organization, there's a agency called the Congressional Budget Office. They measure and score bills. How much does this cost? How much does this save? And they look out over the next decade. And so, sure, okay, Congress may change every 2 years, but 10 years seems to be a level where they feel like with some accuracy, they can say, okay, this is probably going to cost this much this year, this much next year, right, and get a path. Okay. So Congress really functions in these 10-year windows. And so if something saves $100 billion over 10 years, or saves $100 billion, Congress automatically is thinking, all right, this 10-year budget.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea is that site-neutral payments, while certainly sure to be resisted by the hospital systems that will lose that extra revenue, will amount to as much as $100 billion in savings from the government side over the 10-year window. That's what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. I would say, 100 to 200 billion.
Not to mention, as you suggested, the possibility that it will also just decrease what the patient payment portion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It could, but that piece of it is driving it as well. Of course, healthcare is very expensive. Yeah. But that's why the Biden administration in the Inflation Reduction Act was trying to get more and more power to negotiate drug prices, for example, in the Medicare program. Right. This is something that They announced like a whole list of new drugs that they were going to attempt to negotiate drug prices on right before the end of right before President Trump took office. So we'll see where that goes. We'll see if there are other options for prescription drug negotiations or variations on that on a bipartisan basis. But we'll see where it goes.
So you mentioned healthcare being an area where there's room for spending reforms. Mm-hmm. In that case, it sounded like what you were saying is actually just driving the cost structure down. And then you mentioned defense spending.
Yeah. So this is where I think I'm particularly worried about the Trump administration and just trying to give the Defense Department a little bit more of a blank check than what they need. Mm-hmm. I think if you were to really try to think where is there potential for waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, I think you have to actually look at the Defense Department too. Yeah. We all want national security and we all want to be safe and secure, but we got to be thinking really smart of, okay, is this government contractor giving us a good deal? Yeah. Are they building into it? Well, okay, we'll come in at this price, but then we know we can extract more and more when we go back to them, and everyone feels like committed to this one particular weapons system or piece of information technology or whatever. And so, because the Department of Defense is the biggest buyer of a whole bunch of goods and services of all the federal agencies, like you gotta look there. And I just don't think that I just think that on a bipartisan basis, they're going to need to look there and see where can they find some savings, where can they actually root out waste, fraud, and abuse so that, that same amount of money that they were planning on spending could be better spent. So there's been proposals out there for a defense savings commission to come in and at a high level look at a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And that could empower it. Of course, that could be something that Elon Musk's Doge group looks at too.
Contextualize this for me. So I'm of the mind that everything that the fiscal problems facing the United States are so enormous and complicated and so existentially threatening that nobody gets to have any sacred cows. Classically, I think, Republicans when they wanted to reform spending, wanted to look at social welfare. Democrats wanted to look at defense. Everybody has a sacred cow, and then the compromise is you get your money, I get my money, and then the only problem is that now we have a ballooning deficit and debt. So I guess to me, every proposal merits at least a serious consideration, and the problem is bad enough that that it doesn't matter if we keep $50 billion in defense spending that's for our private project, but we're fundamentally compromising the defense readiness of the country by spending it into oblivion. But I contextualize this for me. How much of the federal budget is constituted by defense spending?
Yeah. So look, if about a third of the federal budget goes to annually appropriated spending, that's spending when we talk about when you hear about government shutdowns, that's that type of spending. Yeah. The appropriations committees make all these determinations about what they want to spend the money on. Yeah. That's only about a third of federal spending is looked at annually. Mm-hmm. Defense is half of that. So half of the third, about a sixth of the federal government is defense, which is, it's not nothing.
And it's not nothing. And is that when you look at the long-term trend on defense spending as a share of the federal budget and as a share of GDP as a whole, rising or falling?
Defense spending is rising or flat, but that's a function of how people project spending. I think it's really what is the government wanting to do? What is the policy of the government we have? Yeah. And I think the Trump administration wants to be more aggressive internationally. So I think they're going to increase defense spending, potentially more than the Congressional Budget Office might be projecting. But we'll see. Yeah. And that may be something that they want to pursue in one of their budget reconciliation bills, these fast track processes to get party priorities through.
Right. Now I want to come back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago when you mentioned as an avenue for some of the changes that might need to be made. You mentioned the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, By the way, one of my favorite things working in this space for the last few months anyway has been having to watch like career policy people who take their work very seriously, having to watch them say the word Doge and then watch the grimace of pain that comes over career policy people's faces when they realize that there's going to be a government, some official entity within or semi-official entity within the government named after a meme coin. The schadenfreude that must have been a part of that naming is not lost on me, and I will say I enjoy it. But you've mentioned the Doge. I mean, to you, obviously there's a lot of wet cement and question marks around what it's actually going to be. But what would you, like if they were listening to you, if they were listening to Third Way, what would you recommend? Like it seems like Doge is less about Congress and more about, at least in the way they've talked about it so far, more about executive branch, waste, fraud, and abuse, or what they consider to be like frivolous spending. What would you point them to? How can they get better?
Yeah,
or do better?
Great. It's a great question. And again, as we're talking about this, it's all a moving target. Wet cement, you called it. I think that's the perfect analogy here. So here in DC, we talk about something called program integrity. This is making sure that what you want to spend money on is going to the people that it's supposed to go to, and it's not being abused in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
There are a lot of parts in the government that focus on making sure that the spending is going in the right place. The offices of inspectors general, which are at all the different agencies, are tracking this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Making sure that whenever you try to cut government spending, you're not cutting the people who are the watchdogs for that government spending. I am very worried about that, because when you do big across the board cuts like that, often kind of those groups can get hit. I look at, there's places at the Department of Justice right now that go after people that are defrauding the government. Those are the types of folks that should be getting more funding, potentially, so they can pick up more cases and make sure that any government regime, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, are not losing the people's money to real fraud. That's something I think I focus a lot on. That could create savings, but sometimes you just gotta pay the watchdog to be there, and I worry that they might accidentally get cut.
Accidentally?
Well, accidentally on purpose, I don't know. That is a question for Elon Musk and Doge, and not for me.
Yeah. As you look at it, are there other places where you see avenues for like spending reform where there's actually meat on the bone enough that it can make a difference? I mean, we need to, I think most people drastically underestimate the kind of activity that will be required to stabilize the U.S. fiscal situation. I think, for example, people who resist, this is just going on, conversations that I've had with people as as they were deciding who they would elect or who they would vote for. People who don't want their taxes raised they seem rather convinced that if we just say eliminated all foreign aid, stopped funding the war in Ukraine, and did something about immigration, that those three things together by themselves would and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, which everyone is convinced is maybe there's more of than there actually is. That if we just did those things, you wouldn't have to raise my taxes to fix the fiscal situation of the country, or anyone else's that didn't want it. And by the same token, people who are confronted with the reality that there might need to be drastic reform to the way the government spends its money or spends money, often tend to engage in similar kind of deflationary or deflectionary tactics. What's the things you've described? There's not no money in defense reform. There's certainly not no money in healthcare cost reform. Both of those things sound like really, really fruitful avenues to pursue. What else, if anything else?
Yeah, one piece of the spending puzzle that we don't really talk about because it only gets chipped away at is our growing interest costs.
Yeah,
interest spending on the national debt, you might as well just burn the money, right? It is not a productive use of things. You're not getting an aircraft carrier. You're not keeping a child out of poverty.
Yeah. And you're
not doing any of that.
Yes, and just for contextualization, this last year, interest costs not only, we didn't spend more on interest than an aircraft carrier, we spent more on interest than all the aircraft carriers and all the people who work on it and all the people who fund it, or like that the entire defense budget was less than what we spent this past year on interest.
Yeah.
It's a growing problem.
It's absolutely a growing problem.
So,
The interest spending has been the fastest growing part of the budget. In this Congressional Budget Office projections, it's going to go up and up. And part of that is because we have a large national debt, but part of that is because we have high interest rates. Now, hopefully interest rates are going to go down for a broader variety of economic reasons. But one way that interest costs go down is, you cut spending or raise revenue, because you get, by reducing the future growth of the debt, you're reducing the future growth of interest costs.
And so do you mean by, just to clarify, do you mean by that when you project forward the American fiscal situation, you have to take for granted a certain amount of interest based on a projected amount of growing debt, and therefore decreasing that underlying number decreases interest? Or do you mean that there's a dynamic relationship between projected future debt and interest paid now?
It's a bit of both, right? You're absolutely correct on the former. CBO makes projections on growing deficits, and growing deficits mean more and more national debt, which means more and more interest payments. And, that is absolutely true. But simultaneously, if we can shrink some of those deficits, the actual act of borrowing less will help lower interest costs as well. So there's a bit of a feedback effect there. Right. And this is why taking action sooner rather than later is beneficial. It's a shame that sometimes when we think about paying for policy, you pay for something, that pay for will start in a few years, but we'll get the benefits today. It's all right, I'm going to eat the Twinkie today and I'm going to work out tomorrow. Yeah. But then you get to tomorrow and you're like, damn, I wish I could have another Twinkie. Yeah. And
the federal government can, for a long time, have Twinkies today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. I mean, it's
absolutely. And sometimes there's a really good reason to eat those Twinkies. Yeah. But sometimes there's not. Yeah. But this is the debate we have here. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to keep using the Twinkie analogy, Democrats think the reasons for eating Twinkies are different than Republicans. Uh-huh. And so that's where we get some of this mismatch on what to do.
It sounds like then, if you were to summarize, like these are three things that you think that from your side of the political aisle, three really fruitful areas to pursue are healthcare cost reform, defense spending, and then because of those two, as a sort of like a result of those two, cutting the underlying debt over the 10-year or longer window, lower interest payments.
Yes, all on the spending side. Though I will say, making sure that extending the tax cuts do not increase the debt will make a big difference there too on that piece of interest.
Yeah, it certainly seems like among people who want to extend these tax cuts, it seems like that opinions are divided on the necessity of making them, deficit neutral. I mean, I find that to be astonishing, yet that is the case. As you've looked at it, I've made you sit through this 25-minute conversation on spending, mostly because you're a Democrat. And so I want to talk about the part I want to make you eat your vegetables first. And now we're going to get to the part that Democrats like, which is now we can talk about revenue. But you guys are in an unfortunate headwind right now because it's almost certain that the TCJA, that the Trump tax bill that was passed in 2017, is going to get passed, made at least extended, if not made permanent. What are some of the things that you've looked at that are options for making that extension deficit neutral? And the reason I'm asking is even though Democrat policymakers do tend to, and this is, again, as you said before, it's an unfair simplification, but it's heuristic. They do tend to look at revenue as both the problem and the solution when it comes to the deficit. What the campaigns showed us is that neither side thinks that their voters are in the mood for a tax hike. That seems to me, both in the way both campaigns were run with regards to who was going to pay more taxes, the vast majority of people have no appetite for a tax hike for themselves. And the main difference, it seems to me, between the two versions of tax policy that were on offer is that one was TCJA for everybody and one was TCJA for everybody under $400,000 a year. So they're extremely popular and they're probably going to be made permanent. What are you concerned about when you look at it? What should we do to make these deficit neutral? What are the levers you can pull and what should be pulled?
Yeah. So, look, we're not gonna solve all of the tax revenue debates here today, but I think it's really key to make a couple points. First of all, as you know, we have record high debt and it's growing every day. Those projections on record debt and growing debt, they assume that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts, expire.
Right.
So everything, the not rosy projections, the doom and gloom projections are just worse when those things get extended. If they are not responsibly paid for.
I want you to continue your thought, but just because I recognize we're probably not going to come back to this if I don't do it now, is there a debate happening in Washington right now about how to think about how to paint that window, given that current law, as so-called current law models project the expiration of the TCJA, whereas current policy models don't? Like, is this a debate that you're aware of?
Oh, I mean, everyone in wonky budget world talks about the debate of what is actually
what's at stake in that debate.
What's at stake in that debate is a lot of nerds pointing fingers at a chalkboard. Like it's not actually going to make that much of a difference because the current law baseline, the fact that Congress is going to have to either pay for these things or show that they're increasing the deficit, that's the law of the land. And that's just, I don't think Republicans have the ability to really overturn that here in any way, shape, or form in the short term, using the process that they're going to use.
Isn't it right, though, that for those who are wanting to use so-called current policy, that's been used as a way to pretend that extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act won't actually have any costs?
Yes, that's absolutely true. That if you those that advocate that on a current policy baseline, this is free, that we're just extending what we're already doing, then that works. But then you get into some inherent contradictions. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was not just simple tax cuts. There was a lot of, well, we're going to decrease this tax but increase revenue in this way. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about the SALT deduction, state and local taxes. Do you get to deduct those from your taxes? Well, they put a cap on that in 2017. So on a current law baseline, extending that cap raises money. On a current policy baseline, if you don't extend that cap, you lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of issues that, unless you're just talking about the bill altogether, but you got to forget that the bill is built out of 1,000 Legos.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you were saying, so we're looking at the levers that can be pulled, and what, from your perspective, what are the levers in this thing to pull that can help it cause as little pain as possible to, as you've pointed out, a bad and worsening fiscal situation?
So lots of different things can be done here. Realistically, you can change who is getting some of these tax cuts and rates and extensions. I mean, Democrats would argue that, well, okay, maybe that 400,000 was a reasonable line, or maybe that top marginal rate, that top bracket, can bounce back up a little bit. That pays for a little bit of that stuff. Corporate tax rates were low. There had been a lot of talk of maybe a 25% rate was appropriate back in 2017. Well, it's 21 now. Maybe that's a little bit there. Alternatively, we have all of the spending through the tax code, tax expenditures, that you get a tax deduction for this and a tax deduction for that. I was going to say,
clarify what that means. I mean, what is a tax expenditure?
A tax expenditure is a tax cut for doing something specific. So, or it's a subsidy in the tax code.
Is the child tax credit an example of a tax expenditure?
Yeah, I mean, technically it is. If you're providing a tax benefit for having a child.
Yeah.
But so is also, tax cuts for oil and gas companies, tax cuts for these deductions for state and local taxes, whether or not you can deduct the interest on your home mortgage. And then, there's tons of these in other parts of the tax code.
Yeah.
So that's actually, if you get rid of some of this, that's actually tax simplification and more of a broader point of tax reform than just thinking about the tax rates.
Right.
So that could be something that they could look at. But like anything, You go after this one thing, then there's a constituency and a group that lobbies against it. So that makes it hard. But, this tax debate is going to be very intense. It's going to take a lot longer than President Trump is going to like, because it's just complicated. So we'll see where it ends up at the end of the day.
Yeah. As you guys look at the chessboard at Third Way, is there a time that you guys are like thinking like this is, I know everybody's guessing, like when is TCJA, when is that first move going to get made? What do you guys think?
So the process that they're using here requires them to determine, hey, what game are we playing first? Is this committee going to get invited to the game, or is that committee going to get invited to the game? They have to make all of those determinations up front, and then they go and write the legislation. So they got to figure that out first. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves in an awkward situation, and they're not going to, they run the risk of not getting everything that they want to get done. I think we'll probably see in the next few weeks what the game plan is going to be, if they're going to do one bill or they're going to do two bills. But I'm not anticipating that they deal with taxes, before the summer, just because there's just so much, there's so many pieces to that puzzle that's really, really difficult to do quickly.
Really helpful stuff across the board here. I'm curious, I guess the one reservation I have about everything I've heard is it sounds like you're accepting this is a political reality. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is going to get extended in some form or fashion. That's just going to happen. It also is, and then we've talked about some of the other places where you think, we can do something about some parts of our spending. At the end of the day, it just seems to me, Zach, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I might be. It just seems to me that like the whole story that we spent the last half hour telling here doesn't actually do much when it comes to like stabilizing the national debt, or even slowing down the tendency much. Like what's missing?
I mean, look, this is why for many years a lot of folks have advocated for a fiscal commission of some kind to bring together a lot of people on a bipartisan basis to try to hack at those sacred cows, to try to figure out where we can actually make progress on this stuff, because it's going to be done, with Republicans having the House and Senate and the White House, and they have the ability to use these fast track processes. And that's what they're going to do. That's what Democrats did in the early Biden administration. That's what Republicans did in the early Trump administration, or in the early first Trump administration. So it's just going to be a situation where, if it's not going to, the fiscal situation is not going to probably get better until we all come together and have that broader conversation. And so I think we are due for a fiscal commission, or at least a commission on Social Security. Yeah. And hopefully that will start the process. Yeah. But that's still a process and not actually a solution.
Do you think the slowness in impaneling such a commission is due to a lack of will to recognize the size and scope of the problem? I mean, if you work on this all the time, and a lot of people who know you don't. If they say, look, why is it this bad? Why does the whole thing seem so broken? What do you say?
That was a really good question. Look, I think politics is what it is, right? Like Congress, politicians, there's a lot of agreement that they want to disagree. And there's not a lot of agreement that they want to come together and fix something really big. They can fix pretty small stuff, and then they come together and reach some agreements. But there's been a lot of tension in the last few years about, okay, well, we reach an agreement, and then the agreement goes by the wayside, and now we're back to square one. Yeah. And I think that's been one of the big problems here.
Yeah. Zach, thanks so much for your time. This was enlightening, and I won't say it was encouraging, but it was certainly enlightening.
It's tough to be encouraging when you talk about the federal budget, but it's certainly important, and there's a lot of things that more and more people should learn about.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time, and we'll love to send people your way so they can find out more of what you've had to say on the subject. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the show. Want to dig deeper? Follow us at millennialdebt.org for more insights, updates, and ways to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.